Have you ever noticed how quickly freedom can disappear when people stop seeing you as fully capable? Because control rarely begins with threats or force. Instead, it starts quietly, gently, through concern, through loving voices, through small, protective decisions that slowly grow bigger until one day you realize your life no longer fully belongs to you anymore. And that's exactly how it began with my family. Not with cruelty, not at first, with protection, endless protection. Have you ever realized how dangerous protection becomes once nobody asks whether you still want control over your own life? Because that realization changed everything for me. At first, the extra attention felt harmless enough. My daughter began calling more often after I slipped slightly stepping off the front porch one rainy afternoon. I didn't even fall completely, but somehow that tiny moment changed the way everyone looked at me afterward. Have you ever noticed how one vulnerable moment can quietly redefine you inside other people's minds? Because after that day, my children no longer saw me as independent first. They saw risk. Suddenly, every conversation carried concern underneath it. Was I eating properly? Was I sleeping enough? Was I taking medication correctly? Was I driving safely? At first, I appreciated the care. Families worry, that's normal. But slowly, something inside me began feeling uncomfortable. Have you ever accepted someone's help while secretly feeling pieces of yourself disappearing at the same time? Because that contradiction became exhausting emotionally, my son started visiting the house constantly after that. At first, he fixed little things around the home, changed light bulbs, rearranged cabinets, organized medication. Again, harmless on the surface, thoughtful even, but then the changes became bigger. Furniture moved without asking me first, bills simplified online, appointments scheduled before I agreed to them. Have you ever realized people can slowly step into authority over your life without ever officially announcing it? Because that realization changes ordinary moments completely. One afternoon, I opened my kitchen drawer looking for important documents and realized my son had reorganized everything again while I was asleep in the other room. When I calmly mentioned preferring things the way they were before, he smiled gently and said, "Mom, we're only trying to protect you." Protect. That word started appearing everywhere after that. Have you ever noticed how impossible it feels to argue against protection without sounding unreasonable? Because that's what made everything so confusing emotionally. Slowly, my home stopped feeling fully mine anymore. Little decisions no longer belonged entirely to me. My daughter started insisting on attending every doctor appointment just in case. My son began handling errands before I even asked for help. Every act carried the same quiet assumption underneath it all, that eventually I wouldn't be able to manage things myself anymore. Have you ever realized people often prepare emotionally for your dependence long before it actually exists? Because that understanding terrified me more than I wanted to admit. And the hardest part was this: they genuinely believed they were helping me. That's what made the situation feel so complicated. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly take away someone's dignity? Because dignity was exactly what I felt slipping away piece by piece. Then came the first moment that truly frightened me. One morning, I reached for my car keys near the front door and couldn't find them anywhere. At first, I assumed I had misplaced them. But later that afternoon, my son calmly admitted he had taken them temporarily because everyone felt more comfortable if I avoided driving alone for a while. Temporarily, have you ever had something taken from you so politely that resisting somehow made you feel selfish? Because sitting there listening to him explain this calmly felt surreal. I tried objecting gently at first. I explained I was still perfectly capable of driving myself, but every sentence I spoke only seemed to increase their concern. Have you ever noticed how once people decide you need supervision, defending yourself somehow becomes proof to them that they're right? Because that trap felt impossible to escape emotionally, and then my daughter said something that stayed with me long afterward. "You need to understand we're doing this because we love you." Love, protection, safety, such beautiful words. Yet somehow my world was getting smaller every week they used them. Have you ever realized control sounds kinder once it learns how to disguise itself emotionally? Because that realization changed everything for me. Slowly, the atmosphere inside my own house changed completely. Questions replaced trust. Supervision replaced independence. Decisions happened around me instead of with me. And perhaps the most painful part was this: nobody seemed to notice how humiliating it all felt. Have you ever felt invisible inside conversations about your own life? Because that loneliness settles deeply. One evening during dinner, I forgot the name of a restaurant we visited years ago. just one small memory lapse, a normal human moment, but suddenly the table became strangely quiet afterward. My son and daughter exchanged a quick look they thought I didn't notice, and in that tiny moment of silence, something inside me shifted completely. Have you ever seen people silently agree on something about you without saying it out loud? Because that glance told me more than words ever could. Later that night, as I walked quietly down the hallway toward my bedroom, I overheard my son whispering something in the kitchen that stopped me cold. We may need to become more involved before things get worse. Worse. Have you ever heard people discussing your future like your independence was already disappearing? Because standing there silently outside the kitchen, listening to my own children talk about my life like I wasn't fully part of it anymore, I realized something terrifying for the very first time. They no longer believed they were simply protecting me temporarily. They were slowly preparing to control my life completely. And the next thing they protected me from made my own home start feeling like a prison. Have you ever realized there's a moment when protection quietly becomes imprisonment? Because the scariest kind of prison doesn't always have locked doors or bars on the windows. Sometimes it's built through supervision, permission, and the slow disappearance of your freedom until one day you look around and realize your own life no longer fully belongs to you anymore. And that's exactly what started happening after I overheard my son say they needed to become more involved before things got worse. Worse. That word stayed inside my mind constantly afterward. Have you ever noticed how certain words permanently change the way you see people? Because after hearing that conversation, I started noticing everything differently. And the more I paid attention, the more trapped I began feeling inside my own home. At first, the changes still sounded temporary. That part mattered: temporary restrictions, temporary supervision. Temporary help, but temporary control has a dangerous habit of quietly becoming permanent. Have you ever realized freedom is rarely taken all at once, but slowly enough that resisting makes you feel unreasonable? Because that's exactly how it happened to me. After my son took my car keys, simple things suddenly became complicated. If I wanted groceries, someone insisted on coming with me. If I wanted to go somewhere, questions followed immediately. Where are you going? How long will you be out? Wouldn't it be easier if we handled that for you? Have you ever realized people can slowly turn independence into something requiring permission? Because that realization changes every ordinary moment. One afternoon, I mentioned wanting to visit an old friend across town. Immediately, my daughter started worrying about traffic, directions, stress, and whether it might be too much for me alone. Too much? Have you ever noticed how quickly people begin shrinking your world once they stop trusting your judgment completely? Because my world was becoming smaller every week. Even inside the house, things no longer felt fully mine anymore. Cabinets reorganized, mail opened by accident, medication monitored constantly. Every little detail of my daily life slowly became shared territory instead of personal space. Have you ever felt watched inside your own home? Because that feeling changes something deep inside you. And the strangest part was this: nobody raised their voice, nobody threatened me. Everything happened calmly, politely, lovingly, even. That's what made it feel so confusing emotionally. Have you ever realized control becomes much harder to recognize once it learns how to smile kindly? Because kindness was exactly what made this situation so painful. Then came the phone calls. My daughter started checking in several times a day now, again framed as care, but the conversations slowly stopped feeling like connection and started feeling like monitoring. Had I eaten, taken medication, stayed home, rested enough? Have you ever noticed how quickly concern turns into supervision? Because that shift changes relationships permanently. One evening, I decided to take a short walk alone after dinner. Nothing dramatic. Just fresh air around the neighborhood. But when I returned home, my son looked genuinely upset that I left without telling anyone first. "You can't just disappear like that anymore," he said calmly. Anymore. Have you ever heard someone quietly announce your freedom no longer fully belongs to you? Because that sentence changed everything for me. Suddenly, I realized I was no longer living like an independent adult inside my own family. I was being managed, protected, supervised. Have you ever realized how quickly people can start treating you like responsibility instead of a person? Because that realization terrified me deeply. And perhaps the hardest part was this: every time I pushed back even slightly, their concern only intensified. If I became frustrated, they interpreted it as confusion or stress. If I defended myself calmly, they exchanged worried glances afterward. Have you ever noticed how impossible it becomes to prove your independence once people emotionally decide you've already lost it? Because that trap felt suffocating. Then came the moment that truly frightened me. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter quietly asking my son whether they should start handling more things officially. Officially. Have you ever heard people discussing your future while realizing they no longer see you as fully in charge of your own life? Because standing there silently in the hallway listening to that conversation, I finally understood the truth clearly. This wasn't temporary protection anymore. My children were slowly preparing for authority, real authority, and the scariest part, they genuinely believed they were helping me. Have you ever realized people can slowly take away your freedom while convincing themselves they're protecting you? Because that realization hurts differently than anger. After overhearing that conversation, something inside me changed quietly. Until then, part of me still hoped I was imagining things, overreacting emotionally, becoming too sensitive about ordinary family concern. But now, clarity replaced doubt completely. Have you ever noticed how dangerous clarity becomes once denial finally disappears? Because from that moment forward, I stopped reacting emotionally and started observing carefully instead. And because my children believed I was becoming weaker every day, they never noticed I had started paying attention more closely than ever before. One evening, while putting away laundry upstairs, I accidentally discovered paperwork hidden inside a folder in the guest room. Legal information, financial documents, notes about future planning. My hands shook reading them. Have you ever found proof of something you desperately hoped wasn't real? Because that moment changed everything. Suddenly, every whisper, every protective decision, every missing piece of freedom connected together perfectly. They weren't just protecting me anymore. They were quietly preparing to take control of my life completely. But while my children secretly prepared for control, they made one huge mistake. They underestimated how much I still understood. Have you ever realized the most dangerous thing people can lose isn't freedom itself, but the moment others stop believing you fully understand what's happening around you? Because once someone is labeled confused, every objection becomes emotional, every concern becomes forgetfulness, and suddenly other people start making decisions for your life while convincing themselves they're justified. And that's exactly what my children slowly started doing after they decided protection mattered more than my independence. They thought I didn't fully understand anymore. That was their biggest mistake. Have you ever noticed how quickly people stop hiding things carefully once they underestimate your awareness? Because after finding those papers hidden in the guest room, I began seeing everything differently. Every whispered conversation, every sudden silence when I entered rooms, every helpful decision already made before anyone asked me what I wanted. Suddenly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Have you ever realized people reveal the truth through patterns long before they admit it directly? Because the pattern around me was becoming terrifyingly clear. I carefully returned the documents exactly where I found them before anyone noticed they had been touched. That part mattered, because if my children realized I understood what was happening, they would become careful. And right now, their confidence was still exposing everything. Have you ever stayed quiet simply because silence gave you access to the truth? Because silence became my greatest weapon. After that day, I stopped arguing about little things. I stopped defending myself every time someone questioned my memory or corrected me unnecessarily. And because of that, my family relaxed around me even more. Have you ever watched people lower their guard completely because they believed they already controlled the situation? Because that confidence changed everything in my favor. My son especially had changed. He no longer spoke to me like someone temporarily helping his mother. He spoke like someone managing responsibility now. Every conversation carried subtle authority underneath it. Have you ever noticed how help quietly transforms into ownership once nobody challenges it? Because that shift changes relationships permanently. One evening during dinner, my daughter casually explained she had started organizing important information in case things declined more quickly later. Declined more quickly. Such calm words for something so deeply painful. Have you ever realized people can slowly reduce your entire identity to your worst future possibility? Because hearing them speak about me that way changed something inside me permanently. And still, they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. That was the complicated part. My family wasn't acting out of cruelty. They were acting out of fear, but fear mixed with authority becomes dangerous very quickly. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly destroy someone's dignity? because dignity was exactly what I felt slipping away every day inside that house. Then came the conversation that removed all remaining doubt completely. One night, after everyone thought I had gone to bed, I overheard my son and daughter speaking quietly in the kitchen again. This time, I listened more carefully than ever before. Have you ever overheard something that instantly changed how safe your own family felt? Because that's exactly what happened to me standing silently in that dark hallway. My son mentioned transitioning responsibilities gradually so I wouldn't resist too much emotionally later. Resist emotionally later. Have you ever heard people discussing your future like your voice was becoming less important already? Because those words settled heavily inside me, then the conversation shifted toward finances again. Bills, accounts, legal planning, protecting assets, preparing early. Such calm language, such dangerous meaning underneath it all. Have you ever realized control always sounds responsible in the beginning? Because that understanding terrified me deeply. And then my daughter quietly asked something that stopped me cold. Do you think she fully understands what's happening anymore? Silence followed briefly before my son answered softly, not completely, not completely. Have you ever heard the people closest to you quietly decide your mind no longer fully belongs to you? Because that kind of pain reaches somewhere words barely touch. Standing there in the hallway, listening to my own children discuss me like I was slowly disappearing mentally, I suddenly realized something deeply important. This was no longer only about protection. They had emotionally replaced me already. The real me, the woman who raised them, guided them, protected them for decades, was slowly being replaced by a fragile version easier to supervise and control. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase who you are while still believing they love you? Because that realization changed everything for me. But strangely enough, instead of feeling helpless after overhearing that conversation, I felt clearer than ever before. Because uncertainty finally disappeared completely. Have you ever noticed how dangerous clarity becomes once denial finally ends? Because now I fully understood what was happening around me. My children no longer saw themselves as temporary protectors. They saw themselves as future decision makers over my life. And because they believed I was too confused to fully understand, they stopped hiding their intentions carefully anymore. Have you ever watched people become careless simply because they underestimated you too much? Because that underestimation became my advantage. From that night forward, I stopped reacting emotionally entirely. Instead, I started quietly observing everything: documents, conversations, timing, patterns. And little by little, I began preparing something my family never imagined I was still capable of doing. Because while my children secretly prepared to control my future, I had already started planning how to take my life back. What if the people trying to protect you slowly stopped noticing they were trapping you instead? Because the most dangerous prisons aren't always built with locks and chains. Sometimes they're built through fear, supervision, and the quiet belief that your voice no longer matters as much as everyone else's decisions about your future. And that's exactly what my life had become inside my own home after my children decided I was no longer fully capable of managing it myself. They called it protection, but every day it felt more like imprisonment. Have you ever realized how terrifying it feels when your own life slowly stops belonging to you? Because that fear followed me constantly now. After overhearing my children question whether I fully understood what was happening anymore, something inside me changed completely. Until then, part of me still hoped the situation would somehow correct itself naturally if I stayed patient enough. But now I understood the truth clearly. My children no longer trusted my judgment, and once people stop trusting your judgment, they start replacing it with their own. Have you ever noticed how quickly concern transforms into authority once someone decides you're vulnerable? Because that shift changes everything around you. My freedom became smaller every week after that, not dramatically, quietly, carefully, which somehow made it feel even worse emotionally. Have you ever realized control becomes hardest to fight when it happens slowly enough to sound reasonable? Because every restriction around me came wrapped in logic and concern. My son began insisting someone always accompany me outside the house now: grocery trips, appointments. Even simple walks around the neighborhood suddenly required checking in first. Have you ever noticed how independence slowly turns into permission once people emotionally decide they're responsible for you? Because that realization made my chest feel tight constantly. Inside the house, things no longer felt personal anymore either. Drawers reorganized, documents moved, medication counted. Phone conversations questioned casually afterward. Every corner of my life slowly became shared territory under supervision. Have you ever felt watched inside your own home? Because that feeling changes the meaning of safety completely. And still, nobody acted cruel openly. That's what made the situation feel so emotionally confusing. My children smiled kindly, spoke softly, hugged me, told me they loved me constantly. Yet somehow my world kept shrinking every time they said it. Have you ever realized control sounds gentler once it learns how to disguise itself as love? Because that contradiction exhausted me emotionally. One afternoon, I decided to visit an old friend without telling anyone first. Nothing dramatic, just coffee and conversation, something normal, something human. But when I returned home later, my son looked genuinely upset. Not worried, upset. You can't disappear like that anymore, he said calmly. Anymore. Have you ever heard someone quietly announce your freedom no longer fully belongs to you? Because that sentence stayed inside my head for days afterward. Suddenly, I realized my children no longer saw me as an independent adult making personal choices. They saw me as responsibility, risk, someone requiring management. Have you ever realized people can slowly stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a problem to solve instead? Because that realization hurt deeper than anger ever could. Then came the paperwork again. One evening while cleaning the dining room, I noticed another folder left partially open near the table. This time I didn't hesitate. I already knew enough to understand what I was looking for: legal information. Financial authority discussions, future incapacity planning, such cold phrases attached to my life so casually. Have you ever found proof of something you desperately hoped was only in your imagination? Because that moment changed everything for me completely. Sitting there alone reading those documents, I finally understood something terrifying. My children weren't simply reacting emotionally anymore, they were preparing officially, legally. Quietly, and the most dangerous part, they believed they were justified. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase your independence while still convincing themselves they're good people? Because good intentions mixed with power become dangerous very quickly. But strangely enough, after that moment, I stopped feeling helpless entirely, because now clarity had replaced confusion completely. Have you ever noticed how powerful understanding becomes once fear finally disappears? Because sitting there with those papers in my hands, I realized something important. My children believed I was becoming weaker every day. They believed I didn't fully understand what was happening around me anymore, and because of that, they stopped watching me carefully enough. Have you ever watched people become careless simply because they underestimated you completely? Because their confidence became my opportunity. From that point forward, I stopped reacting emotionally altogether. I smiled calmly, nodded politely, allowed them to continue believing their version of reality completely. And while they focused on controlling the prison they quietly built around my life, I had already started planning my way out of it behind their backs. Have you ever known something that could completely change a situation and quietly waited for the perfect moment to reveal it? Because that's exactly where I was now. One morning, while my daughter sat in the kitchen making coffee, I quietly made a phone call they never imagined I was still capable of making alone. And the moment that call ended, the balance of power inside the family changed forever. Because the next move I secretly made behind my children's backs destroyed the entire story they built about me. What happens when the person everyone quietly dismissed as weak finally stops surviving emotionally and starts preparing strategically instead? Because there's something dangerous about underestimating someone, you stop imagining they're capable of protecting themselves. And that's exactly what my children failed to realize while they spent months building control around my life inside the name of protection. They believed I was becoming powerless. But secretly, I had already started taking my power back. Have you ever realized people often become most vulnerable the moment they think they already won? Because that confidence became my greatest advantage. The morning I made that phone call, my hands shook slightly dialing the number. Not from confusion, not from weakness, from clarity. Have you ever made a decision that instantly changed how trapped you felt? Because that call changed something deep inside me immediately. I contacted someone completely outside the family, independent, professional, someone whose opinion couldn't be shaped by fear, whispers, or emotional assumptions about aging. And for the first time in months, someone finally spoke to me directly instead of around me. Have you ever realized how different it feels when someone treats you like a capable adult again after months of supervision? Because hearing my own voice taken seriously nearly made me emotional, I explained everything carefully: the missing keys, the supervision, the hidden paperwork, the conversations about future planning, the growing feeling that my children no longer trusted me to control my own life anymore. Have you ever finally spoken the truth out loud after carrying it silently for months? Because that moment changed everything for me. The response shocked me more than anything else. Calmly, professionally, I was reminded of something nobody inside my own family had bothered reminding me of in a very long time. I still had rights, full independence, full authority over my own life unless proven otherwise legally and fairly. Have you ever realized how powerful it feels when someone finally reminds you you still belong to yourself? Because after months of feeling managed, monitored, and quietly erased, that realization felt overwhelming emotionally. I started organizing my own protection quietly after that call: legal advice, financial reviews, personal documentation, independent evaluations if necessary, every step carefully planned, every move completely private. And because my children still believed I was passive and confused, they never noticed any of it happening. Have you ever realized underestimated people often become invisible in the most useful way possible? Because that invisibility became my greatest advantage. Meanwhile, my family continued growing more comfortable with control every day. Dinner conversations became increasingly open about future responsibilities. My son casually mentioned long-term arrangements, now like they were inevitable. My daughter started discussing what would be easiest later more directly. They genuinely believed the future already belonged to them emotionally. Have you ever noticed how expectations slowly become entitlement once people stop questioning their assumptions? Because entitlement changes behavior fast. Then came the dinner that changed everything completely. My son brought paperwork to the table again, speaking gently, patiently, carefully, the same careful tone people use with someone they no longer fully trust mentally. He explained these were simple arrangements meant to make life safer and easier moving forward. Safer, easier. Such beautiful words attached to something that suddenly felt terrifyingly clear. Have you ever realized control sounds kindest right before it asks for permission? Because that's exactly what this moment became. Everyone around the table watched me quietly now, waiting, expecting hesitation, expecting confusion, expecting surrender. But what they didn't know was this: while they spent months building a story about my weakness, I had already built my own protection behind their backs. Have you ever known a moment was about to change everything before anyone else in the room realized it yet? Because sitting there looking down at those papers, I understood something deeply important. My children still believed they controlled this situation completely, but they had no idea the woman they treated like a prisoner had already found the key to her freedom long before this dinner even started. I looked at the documents calmly for several seconds before finally asking one simple question: why would I sign authority papers after what my attorney explained to me? Silence, complete silence. Have you ever watched confidence disappear from someone's face instantly? Because that's exactly what happened around that table. My son froze, my daughter stared at me in shock. And suddenly, for the first time in months, the prison they quietly built around my life began collapsing right in front of them. Have you ever seen people suddenly realize they underestimated you completely? Because that realization is impossible to hide. I stayed calm after that. Calmness mattered more than ever now. I explained quietly that after discovering the paperwork and overhearing conversations for months, I had already contacted professionals privately myself: independent legal advice, independent financial protection, independent evaluations. Everything they believed I was too weak or confused to handle alone, I had already handled successfully behind their backs. Have you ever realized the people questioning your capability often panic most when you prove them wrong? Because panic filled the room completely now. And suddenly, for the very first time in a long time, nobody at that table was speaking to me like I was powerless anymore. But what my son admitted after the truth finally came out hurt more than every restriction and hidden paper combined. What hurts more than losing your freedom is discovering the people who took it truly believed they were justified, because control becomes most dangerous when it hides itself inside love, concern, and fear. And that painful truth became impossible to ignore after my children realized the woman they treated like a prisoner had understood everything all along. The room stayed completely silent after I mentioned speaking with attorneys and professionals privately. Not tense silence at first, shocked silence. The kind that appears when reality suddenly changes too fast for people to hide their true emotions immediately. Have you ever watched certainty disappear from someone's face in real time? Because that's exactly what I saw around the dinner table that night. My son looked stunned, not angry yet, just shaken in a way I had never seen before. For months, he believed he was gradually helping a mother becoming incapable of managing her own life. And suddenly, the entire story he built emotionally about me cracked open right in front of him. Have you ever realized people sometimes believe their own narrative so deeply they stop questioning whether it's actually true, because that realization changes relationships forever? The questions came quickly afterward, too quickly. Why would I contact attorneys without telling them? Why involve outsiders? Why would I assume the worst about my own family? But listening to those questions felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. Have you ever noticed how people become hurt by boundaries when they already expected control, because expectations change how people interpret your independence? I answered calmly. That part mattered. Because by then, I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. I was trying to reclaim my dignity. I explained something simple. I contacted professionals because nobody around me was speaking honestly to me anymore. They were speaking about me, around me, over me, but rarely directly to me. Have you ever realized people can slowly take away your voice while convincing themselves they're helping you? Because that realization hurts deeper than anger ever could. My daughter started crying quietly after that. She said they were only scared something serious would happen before they prepared properly. Scared I would decline quickly and suffer because nobody stepped in early enough. And strangely enough, I believed her. That was the complicated part of everything. I truly believe fear existed inside my family. But fear mixed with authority becomes dangerous very quickly. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly destroy someone's dignity? Because dignity was exactly what I felt disappearing inside that house. Then my son finally admitted something that hurt more than every missing key, every hidden document, every whispered conversation combined. He looked at me quietly and said, "We really thought you were starting to lose yourself." Lose yourself. Not occasionally forgetful, not needing extra support. Lose yourself. Have you ever heard the people closest to you quietly admit they stopped believing in your mind completely? Because that kind of pain reaches somewhere words barely touch. For a moment, I couldn't even answer. Not because I felt weak, but because suddenly I understood the real betrayal underneath everything. This was never only about protection. It was about identity. My children had slowly replaced the real me with a version easier to supervise emotionally. A fragile older woman, confused, dependent, easier to manage than trust. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase who you are while still believing they love you completely? Because that realization changes something permanent inside you. I finally looked directly at my children and told them something I had carried silently for months. I said forgetting small things does not erase a lifetime of intelligence. Aging does not remove someone's right to independence. And needing occasional help does not mean surrendering your freedom, your choices, or your voice entirely. Have you ever realized dignity matters just as much as safety? Because that truth became clearer to me than anything else during this entire experience. I also told them something harder to admit aloud. The most painful part wasn't the supervision, it wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't even losing my car keys. The most painful part was realizing my own children slowly stopped seeing me clearly. Have you ever realized how lonely it feels when the people who raised you begin questioning whether you fully understand your own life anymore? Because that loneliness changes you deeply. The room stayed quiet after that, but differently now. Honest quiet, no pretending anymore, no fake reassurance, just truth sitting openly between all of us for the first time in months. And strangely enough, that truth brought relief too, because finally, nobody was treating me like a prisoner anymore. Nobody was speaking over me. Nobody was making decisions for me while smiling kindly to my face. They were finally listening, truly listening. Have you ever noticed how quickly power returns once people finally acknowledge your voice again? Because that recognition changes everything. I didn't feel victorious sitting there. That's important. This was never about humiliating my children or proving I was smarter than them. It was about reclaiming myself before I disappeared completely inside their fears and assumptions about aging. And thankfully, I realized what was happening before it became permanent. Later that night, after everyone left and the house became quiet again, I sat alone thinking about how easily ordinary concern had slowly transformed into control inside my family. One small fall, one forgotten word, one moment of vulnerability, tiny things that slowly became justification for taking away my freedom piece by piece. And suddenly, I understood something deeply important. People may call it protection, they may even truly believe they're helping you, but real love does not slowly turn someone's life into a prison. And the final thing I said before leaving that dinner table left my entire family completely silent. What happens after people finally realize they crossed the line between protecting someone and controlling them? Because the hardest truth for my family to face wasn't that I contacted attorneys or uncovered their plans. It was realizing they slowly stopped seeing me as a person with dignity and started seeing me as a problem they needed to manage. And once that truth entered the room, nothing inside our family felt the same anymore. The silence after our conversation that night felt heavier than any argument could have. Not angry silence, reflective silence. The kind that appears when people suddenly recognize parts of themselves they never wanted to see clearly before. Have you ever watched someone realize their good intentions caused real damage? Because that realization sat across the dinner table from me now. My daughter kept crying quietly. My son looked exhausted emotionally, like the entire version of reality he spent months building had suddenly collapsed underneath him. And for the first time in a very long time, nobody was speaking to me like I was fragile anymore. Nobody interrupted me, nobody corrected my words, nobody watched me with quiet evaluation in their eyes. They were finally seeing me again, truly seeing me. Have you ever noticed how quickly respect returns once people realize they can no longer control the story about you, because that shift changes everything? But even then, something inside me still hurt deeply. Not because my children worried about me growing older. Fear is human. I understood that. The real pain came from realizing how quickly fear turned into authority. How easily concern became permission to slowly remove my freedom without fully noticing it. Have you ever realized people can cross dangerous lines very slowly while still believing they're loving you? Because that understanding changed me permanently. My son finally looked at me quietly and admitted something painful. He said, "We thought we were doing the right thing." And strangely enough, I believed him. That was the complicated truth underneath everything. I do believe my children loved me. I do believe they were scared. But love mixed with fear becomes dangerous once it stops respecting the person it's trying to protect. Have you ever realized real love protects someone's dignity too, not just their safety? Because dignity was the part of me I nearly lost inside that house. I finally told my children something I had been carrying silently for months. I said protection without respect becomes control, help without permission becomes supervision, and fear should never become an excuse for taking someone's voice away. Have you ever realized freedom isn't only about leaving your house or driving your car? Sometimes it's about being trusted to remain yourself. Because that truth became clearer to me than anything else. The room stayed quiet after that, but this time the silence felt different, softer somehow, honest. For the first time in months, nobody was trying to convince me of anything anymore. Nobody was trying to manage my emotions, explain away my fears, or gently guide the conversation toward what they thought was best for me. They were finally listening without controlling. Have you ever noticed how powerful it feels when your voice fully belongs to you again? Because after months of feeling trapped inside other people's decisions, that feeling almost overwhelmed me emotionally. I also admitted something difficult that night. I told them I understood why they became afraid after seeing me forget small things or struggle occasionally. Aging is frightening, not only for the person growing older, but for the people watching it happen too. But fear does not erase someone's humanity. Fear does not give anyone ownership over another person's life. Have you ever realized people can unintentionally dehumanize someone simply by becoming too afraid to lose them? Because that realization sat heavily between all of us. My daughter apologized through tears for making me feel trapped inside my own home. My son admitted he stopped asking what I wanted because somewhere along the way, he convinced himself he already knew better. And hearing that hurt, but it also explained everything. Have you ever realized control often begins the moment someone believes your choices matter less than their fear, because that understanding changes how you see relationships forever. I didn't leave that table feeling victorious. That's important. This was never about defeating my children or humiliating them emotionally. It was about reclaiming my identity before I slowly disappeared inside everyone else's version of what my future should look like. And thankfully, I realized what was happening before it became permanent. Later that night, after everyone left and the house became quiet again, I sat alone in the living room thinking about how easily freedom can disappear once people stop seeing you clearly. One forgotten word, one small fall, one vulnerable moment. Tiny things that slowly became permission for others to take over more and more of my life while calling it protection. And suddenly, I understood something deeply important. People may take your keys, they may question your memory, they may even convince themselves you're too weak to manage your own future. But real freedom, the kind built from dignity, self respect, and the courage to keep your own voice alive, is something nobody can take unless you surrender it yourself. And thankfully, I never did. They called it protection, but real love never turns someone's life into a prison.